Okay. So Wednesday you did a reading that covered Shays Rebellion, which in a lot of ways is the event that is going to finally put the notion of the Articles being a weak form of government. It's gonna kind of be the final event that convinces people that something has to be done with the Articles, because there's a number of weaknesses that it has, which we have addressed, and we'll talk about again. But Shays Rebellion centers on a rebellion of farmers in Massachusetts, and the fact that the federal government is essentially powerless to do anything, promotes a really big concern among the founders and major people during the revolution about the state of the country, the future of the country. And so that's going to be something that is going to be a great concern. So what I want to do is, first of all, I only have about 10 to 15 Declaration of Independence assignments, the assessment assignments to grade. But those that are in Skyward, you're going to notice a couple things. There'll be a grade in there, or it'll be marked as incomplete. And I want to draw your attention to that. And I am missing some still, but I want to draw your attention to that. And that's as of this morning. First of all, this is an assessment grade. So the assignment's called 8.1.5 Declaration Assessment. That is an assessment grade. And there's two categories in the class. Assessments or projects are 70%, classwork is 30%. So this falls under the 70% category, meaning if you don't do it, it's not a situation where you're going to be able to recover your grade. A 0 out of 10 on that kind of weighted assignment is going to have a very negative effect. So if you have not finished that assignment, you need to do that as soon as possible. It's over a week past due. The other thing with that assignment, and again, I want to show people where to find these assignments because I've had numerous people contact me saying, hey, I have a missing assignment. I don't know where to find it. So please pay attention and listen carefully. If you go to the course page, right here, this big red button says List of Course Assignments. If you go there, it's going to take you to the assignments. Now, I have to add the Shays Rebellion reading on there, but everything for this grading period is right here. And some of these assignments are missing for some people. So if you're missing the Hereditary Monarchy assignment from Thomas Paine, it's right here. If you're missing the Declaration of Independence assignment, it's right here. If you're missing the Boston Massacre assignment, which is going on almost 3.5 weeks now, that's here. Okay? So I want to pause and I want to go over this assignment again. Okay? So the question that I prompted for you about a week ago was, once we had discussed the Declaration, I wanted you to think about how it was at the time and how it could still be considered to be a radical and treasonous document. And when it asks you what ideas and it may still be radical today, I've gotten a lot of really good answers on this. I'm not downplaying that. The answers have been really good overall. But in some cases, we're not quite where we need to be in terms of the answer. Because there's a couple of things you need to be clear on. All right. The more specific you can be in what you are referencing in the document, the better. Because I had some people saying like, a colony fighting a country or being ruled by a king or, and some of those themes are the very broad themes with the document. So what I was kind of encouraging you to do, and I did mention this when we went over it, is to focus more on specific ideas. So ideas in the introduction, or something in the grievances, or something in the statement of rights, something in there that you can specifically reference. And I did see a lot of good answers for this. I'm not saying I didn't, but in some cases, if it's marked incomplete or you didn't get full credit, it's because there's something in the answer that's not quite getting it over the edge. And here's the other thing. I wanted 5 to 7 sentences, and in some cases I got 2 sentences. That's not going to be enough. If your answer is along the lines of, the idea of all men are created equal is still radical today because not everybody's created equal. Well, if that's what you believe, you need to go into more detail and give me some evidence to support that. Okay? So I have tried to give very thorough feedback, which you can see if you go to the page. And if you have an incomplete marked in Skyward, or if you did not receive the full credit, that's something to look at. You got 10 out of 10 if you answered the question fully, you've explained specifically the parts of the declaration that you are identifying as being radical and treasonous today, and you can directly relate it to why it's still radical today. That's the big thing. Okay, there was a couple of them that, a couple ideas in the document that may be radical at that time, but it's really hard to explain how they're radical today. Like the relationship between Britain and the United States. Some people were saying that, well, it's stated in the declaration that, we were going to be enemies with Britain. Well, it doesn't mean that we were always going to be enemies with Britain, because it does say at enemies during war and then afterwards friendly during peace. I'm paraphrasing, but there's a few things that are it's going to be kind of a stretch to make it work. And so that's why it is a more challenging question. It is something that's going to require you to put in some thought. So please address those. And if you haven't turned those in, please get those done as soon as possible, because we're going to be pushing on. We're going to be getting into government more. We're going to be doing some stuff there. We're going to have probably an assessment, a true assessment of some kind coming up within the next week or two on the ideas of government. And I'll talk more about it at that time, but I just want to make sure we are aware of that. So does anybody have any questions about that? Okay, I got hands up. I'll address in just a second here. Okay, Eileen, what's your question?
I thought I remembered you saying that we were not supposed to do the 8.1.5 assessment.
No. What you were not supposed to do is the vocabulary, and I've deleted that. I can't, for whatever reason, delete it after the fact for the in Canvas. Okay, and it's my fault for labeling it. See, the problem is that the way I label things, I have to try to stay consistent, and I'm going to have to try to vary things in the future, because I have 3 advanced sections, 2 in person, 1 online. I'm trying to keep things consistent in terms of the delivery and the information that you are all receiving, so it's not as if you are getting an abbreviated version of the course online just because we're not in person. With that said, I can't really assess vocabulary online, obviously. So what the exit ticket is referring to, what this is referring to is just, this is only, what I just showed you is only worded something different in Skyward. So it's worded as 8.1.5 declaration assignment. The one I don't need you to do, is the vocabulary. Okay. So the other one that you do need to do is the exit ticket, which is what I just referenced, which was what we assigned. It was Friday, not this past Friday, but the one before that. Joyce?
So you've graded all the assignments that were turned in, or?
No. I'm trying to get caught up on grading. I have about alphabetically. So if you're toward the end of the alphabet, I think Kai was the last one I graded for this course, and the rest of them I'll have done this afternoon. So Sinead, you're not going to have yours yet. Marcus, yours is not going to be there yet. If you're in the latter half of the alphabet, that's why you don't have it graded yet. So sorry, I should have made that clear at the beginning. The ones that are graded will have a grade in Skyward, or it'll be marked incomplete. And what students need to do is they need to go to the assignment itself where you submitted it and see the feedback that I gave you. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. Okay, if you could please pull up the reading from last Wednesday, the one that you submitted, that was the Newsella reading on Shays Rebellion. I want to talk about a couple themes in there related to how we've gotten to the point of a rebellion post-American Revolution, okay? So go ahead and pull that up. We're not going to go over the questions specifically because I do have some people that have not turned it in, and I'm not just going to go over the questions themselves. I will go over some of the ideas here. And when you kind of, I mean, the title itself of the reading kind of tells you all that you need to know here. Crisis in the Infant U.S. Republic. So we're talking about at the early stages of the country's history. And even they call themselves a republic, which I think is a little bit misleading because they were very much a confederacy. They may have seen the idea of the government being a republic because the leaders are elected and representation falls directly by individuals who are voted into positions. But we were very much a confederacy. There's no question about that. And part of the reason why confederacies do not exist in the world today is because they don't work. The two examples we've seen in American history were very unsuccessful. Okay. And so a couple of things we need to know about post-revolution America. So the Revolutionary War ends in 1783, and that's when Britain fully acknowledges through the Treaty of Paris that we are a separate independent nation. Okay. We've identified ourselves in that regard since 1776, but we knew, as the Declaration stated, that we'd have to win a war against Britain for that to be fully acknowledged. Okay. So in that situation, when the war is over in 1783 officially, we are now in a circumstance where we have, we have a recovery period, okay? And the economy is going to struggle. And the biggest reason the economy is going to struggle is because we issued paper money in huge quantities that was deemed worthless. Because when you print too much money, paper money, you get into a situation where inflation happens, which there may be more paper in circulation, paper money in circulation, but ultimately the price of goods goes way up. I'm hearing feedback. There we go. Sorry. I have my phone up so I can see if anybody's raising their hand while we're doing this. Sorry, that's my fault. Okay, so paper money is really deemed useless. And what states decided to do to address the issue of severe debt after the revolution is they began to tax farmers, landowners, and they would tax them at very high rates to help pay off the debt. Okay. And the thing that's very interesting about this is that a good portion of these farmers, and not just Massachusetts, but in several states, that were being taxed through the roof on their land were veterans. The very people that served during the Revolution, who had returned home to adjust to civilian life, and then the states began to tax them through the roof to pay off the debt. Okay. The problem is that like many of these farmers and many of these veterans, they didn't have the money. Part of the problem is that a lot of veterans had what were called promissory notes, these pieces of paper that said the government owed them a significant amount of back pay through their service, and the government had no money to pay because the government had no real authority to tax. Again, going back to the ongoing issues with this document. And so in order to basically deal with the situation in a state like Massachusetts, is they would issue warnings to the landowners that you have so much time to pay off your debts. And if you don't, you're going to be brought into what's called debtor's court. And you're going to be put in front of the judge in your community, and they're going to sentence you to debtor's prison. And this is not a new concept. Debtor's prisons existed for centuries in Britain. The idea of being a debtor, owing money to the crown. I mean, Georgia, the colony, was created largely because of a significant number of debtors in Britain who were sent to Georgia to work on farmland to pay off their debts to the crown. Okay. But when you get a number of people in a community that are affected by this, and a lot of them are veterans who feel betrayed for their service because they're getting kicked off their land and then have that land sold to wealthy investors who live along the coast, like near Boston, where the majority of the money was, you're going to have a real crisis. And if those people begin to band together and have a common, alliance because they're all being affected, you're going to get people who are willing to do, a lot of the same things they were doing during the revolution toward Britain, now toward the state and federal government. And so that's what happened. Daniel Shays, for example, a very well-known military leader in the Continental Army, was a captain, very well known throughout Massachusetts. He kind of banded together and created this like resistance group, large resistance group, hundreds of people in Massachusetts. And what they would do is they would go around to communities and they would close the courts. They would basically, by force, cause the courts to not take place. They would board them up and they would guard them. And the idea is that if there's no court in session, then nobody's losing their land. And therefore the debtors get to remain on their land. Well, this armed resistance brought in a lot of concern to the leadership in the colony or in the state. And there were other concerns in other states about this possibly happening. So what do you think they did? They appealed to the federal government, the U.S. government. What's the response going to be from the U.S. government in that situation? Well, basically going to be you're on your own, because the U.S. government doesn't have the authority to organize any kind of response to this rebellion. Now think about that, for example. Think about that for a moment. If the federal government doesn't have the ability to stop or intervene in a resistance situation in one single state, how would they possibly be able to defend us, the country, from an invasion? They wouldn't. They wouldn't be able to do that. And so what happened is James Bowdoin, who was the governor of Massachusetts, basically had to get a bunch of rich people in Boston to pledge money to hire an army to go and stop this group. And one of the people, and this is so ironic to me, one of the people that pledged a lot of money was Samuel Adams. And if you don't remember that name, Samuel Adams was one of the people that was the leader of the Sons of Liberty, a rebellious revolt resistance group, just like the Shays Rebellion, the Shayites. So it's interesting that now Samuel Adams has changed his tone on this idea of an armed resistance group when he was perfectly fine with it toward Britain. And he says, well, it's different when you're talking about the U.S. government versus the British government. So what ultimately happens is Shays and his men are stopped. But the picture it paints is very troubling. Okay? Because if you have a situation where the federal government cannot intervene, like I said, in a circumstance like this, you got a big problem. Frank?
What reasons did Samuel Adams give for why the U.S. government resisting the U.S. government was different than resisting the British government?
Because he saw it, that's a great question. He saw it as tyranny through a monarchy versus disrespect for your elected government. He said it's an entirely different concept when you're talking about a tyrannical leader 3,000 miles away versus the government of your state that's elected by people like yourself. In his mind, it was an entirely different concept. Now, most people said, no, it's not, because the people that were being affected, these farmers, felt as if they had no voice in government, they had no ability, and their appeals. And here's the other thing that I forgot to mention. The very people that were getting kicked off their land were voicing their concern through petitions and grievances to the state government of Massachusetts, and those petitions and grievances were not being responded to. So that it's kind of mirroring the same situation that we as colonies were dealing with when we sent petitions to Britain. But in this case, Adams has evidently matured significantly, or doesn't see the correlation between the two. And he's very much responsible for funding these purchased militias, or, I don't know if they're mercenaries is the term, but purchasing these militias and soldiers to band together to stop these farmers. But in the greater sense, it's not so much about what state it's occurring in. Here's the problem. If I'm George Washington and I'm sitting in Mount Vernon enjoying retirement, and I'm hearing through communication with people who served under me in the Continental Army or other people that I've known for years, like prominent politicians like John Jay, Thomas Jefferson, and I'm hearing about the discontent of what's going on in Massachusetts, I'm concerned. Because my attitude as George Washington is I didn't sacrifice everything during the Revolution only to have the government have zero ability to function and to stop a domestic, resistance like Shays' Rebellion. And so even though we can't narrow it down specifically to, the event of Shays' Rebellion itself, the Shays' Rebellion situation kind of was the last straw for people concerned with the articles and saying, we need to do something about it. Okay. And so when you look at Shays' Rebellion in a larger sense, what's going on here? Hold on a second. When you look at it in a larger sense, it's really like the icing on the cake. Because if you look at the issues that we have here, no power to collect taxes, no power to regulate trade, no power to enforce laws, the approval of 9 states to get a law passed, the approval of all states to amend the articles, no executive branch to enforcement, no national court system, you've really put yourself in a situation where something has to be done. And the political cartoon kind of represents it in another way, where the ship is the Articles of Confederation and the waves crashing against them are the weaknesses of the document. Okay, so all in all, it's for a lot of people, it's painting a very negative picture. And so in theory, what has to happen is revisions have to be made. It's important to know that we think of a constitutional convention now as the event that began the country's history towards the new constitution that we use today. But the original intention of the meeting was not to get rid of the Articles of Confederation, it was to revise it. And that's primarily because the majority of the people who asked for the convention to take place believed that if they sent notification out to members of the states, like the legislatures, to send representatives to this meeting to get rid of the articles, they wouldn't have enough people show up to have the necessary number to actually have a meeting be official. Because people are like, people would say, why would I go to this meeting if all it does is ends up being the doom and the end of the Articles of Confederation? Because you have to understand, even with all these weaknesses that we see here, there were still plenty of people who liked the Articles of Confederation. They may have agreed that it wasn't perfect, but the Articles of Confederation significantly gave more power to the states than the federal government. And remember, the mindset is, we just got out of the circumstance of being under the rule of a king who abused his power. We don't want any part of that again, okay? But with that said, even those people who liked the articles realized that they were going down a very dangerous path if certain changes weren't even at least considered with the articles, okay? And so when we look at what ultimately leads to the creation of a new government, we're going to look at it through a metaphor situation. All right. And even though we're going to look at this timeless children's classic story to express the way that this took place, and I know you're all on the edge of your seat in excitement to what I'm going to be disclosing to you, it's pretty common way to look at it, and it's a pretty effective way to look at it. So obviously you can figuratively elbow partner, think about it, but think about to yourself this statement. The Founding Fathers and the creation of the U.S. government is the story of Goldilocks and the Three Bears. Again, the Founding Fathers and the creation of the U.S. government is the story of Goldilocks and the Three Bears. So does somebody want to kind of explain that metaphor in terms of what we are looking at here? Sloan.
It's like the first one, which was the British government, was like too oppressive and focused on the main government, but then the new government with the Articles of Confederation was too state focused and didn't have enough control in the federal government, but then the last one had like a balanced amount.
Yeah, very well said. Thank you. And if we connect that analysis to Goldilocks, well, let me just enlighten you again about the story of Goldilocks and the Three Bears, shall we? Once upon a time, I know if your parents are there, like, why are you reading Goldilocks and Three Bears? There's a purpose here. There's a purpose here. Once upon a time, there was a little girl named Goldilocks. She went for a walk in the forest. Pretty soon she came upon a house. She knocked, and when no one answered, she walked right in because, of course, that's what you would do normally, right? No, of course not. At the table in the kitchen, there were 3 bowls of porridge. If you don't know what porridge is, it's like oatmeal. Goldilocks was hungry. She tasted the porridge from the first bowl. "This porridge is too hot," she exclaimed. So she tasted the porridge from the second bowl. "This porridge is too cold." So she tasted the last bowl. "Ah, this porridge is just right." She said happily, and she ate it all up. After she'd eaten the Three Bears breakfast, she decided that she was feeling a little tired, so she walked into the living room where she saw 3 chairs. Goldilocks sat in the first chair to rest her feet. "This chair is too big," she exclaimed. So she sat in the second chair. "This chair is too small," she whined. So she tried the last chair. "Ah, this chair is just right." So we get the sense of what we're looking at here, and there's a visual of what we're discussing. But basing on what Sloan said correctly, this is the mindset of the founding father. Now, does anybody know which founding father we see there pictured? It's not George Washington, I will tell you that. Does anybody know?
Is it John Adams?
It's not John Adams. It's a good question. Somebody in my earlier class made the comment that they all seem to look the same. And I said, well, it's kind of the fashion statement. David, what do you think?
Is it Thomas Jefferson?
Another great guess, but not Thomas Jefferson. It is the 4th president of the United States, James Madison, who is also credited with being the father of the U.S. Constitution and also, fun fact, the shortest U.S. president in history at 4 feet 11 inches tall. I know, crazy, right? Mind blown. So his mindset going into this convention to revise the Articles, in which en route to Philadelphia, he will actually write out a new form of government with 3 distinct branches and so forth, called the Virginia Plan. His mindset is the British government we had over us as colonies is too strong. The Articles of Confederation we had is too weak or too state-focused, as Sloan said correctly. But the U.S. Constitution I envision is just right. And so to conclude for today, if we had analyzed the 3 parts, the founding fathers were looking for a government that was just right. Now, the term founding fathers is pointing to those individual and influential people who at the very beginning had a major role in the start of America. And there are numerous people. We think of John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, George Washington, Benjamin Franklin. There's more than that. So they were looking for a government that was just right. The first government we had under the British was too strong, just like the porridge was too hot. The second porridge was too cold, just like the Articles were too weak. The last porridge that Goldilocks tried was not too hot or too cold. It was just right, just like the government that we will create under the U.S. Constitution is just right. And so tomorrow, we're going to be looking at this chart, which has the 3 governments at the top and 3 different category of indicators that we're going to go through together to see the comparisons of the 3 different government types, the first 2, which we are familiar with, and the third that we're going to be learning more about then. Does anybody have any questions before we adjourn? Sinead?
Do we have an exit ticket today?
Nope. Everybody's here, so we're good to go. I will see you tomorrow at 12 o'clock. And we're gonna discuss the chart. We're gonna work on that chart together. I'll send out a PDF version of the chart for you because I want you to work on it as we go through. And we'll kind of talk about the evolution of the discussion over the new Constitution. All right. I hope you have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.